What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some details and my own thoughts about the recent reveals for Dragon Age The Veilguard, following, of course, its brand new trailer highlighting all of the companions, as well as a roughly 20-minute gameplay reveal that followed afterwards. Now, I waited a little longer than I would have liked to normally to put this video out because, to get the elephant out of the room, so to speak, the trailer was pretty rough, followed by a gameplay reveal that was better but still left me with some questions. And basically, I wanted to compile all my thoughts and just get as much information together as I could before I made this video talking about these things. But broadly speaking, I thought the gameplay reveal itself was pretty good, even if for the fourth time in a row they're making a game that is quite different from the other games in that series, which is going to, of course, lead to some polarizing opinions. But let's start at the beginning. So this game was originally called Dragon Age Dreadwolf, but recently had its name changed to The Veilguard. Honestly, in the grand scheme of things, not that big of a deal. I will say that I preferred the Dreadwolf title, but the Veilguard one isn't so bad if they would just drop the from it, as Dragon Age Veilguard sounds better than Dragon Age The Veilguard. But ultimately, not really a huge deal in the end. So let's talk a little bit about that reveal trailer. Honestly, I'd chalk it up to bad marketing, but initially, this past weekend at the big showcases, we got a trailer for the initial announcement of the name change as well as a release date of later this fall. But that trailer was largely panned for being, let's say, very off in its tone and how it approached the setting and everything, with an art style that just kind of didn't look right. However, luckily, a lot of the concerns that were generated by that trailer were alleviated with the gameplay reveal that you've likely seen in the background up to this point. And in-game, with that art style in motion, I think it looks much better. Even if it's still maybe a little bit too stylized for my own preferences, I do think largely it looks better when the lighting is a little more dark and moody. But with that out of the way, let's talk about the rest of this. Now, I'm compiling information from a ton of different places because besides just the trailer and the reveal, they've also been dropping information on their website, on Twitter, etc. So this stuff is coming from a lot of different places, and I kind of want to go through it in order. I will have a section at the end talking purely about my own opinions, so if you're just looking for that because you've already watched all this stuff, maybe jump down a ways. But right away, it was announced that this game is going to feature an in-depth character creation that's going to see you picking between a dwarf, elf, human, or Qunari, and that character creation will also include a choice of a backstory featuring your involvement in one of 6 different factions. These factions being things like the Antivan Crows, etc., that establish our character, who is known as Rook, and what they got up to, of course, before the game started. Now, it's my understanding that each of these factions is going to come with 3 very distinct buffs, that is to say, like extra damage to certain types of enemies, etc., but also, of course, as expected, extra dialogue that then relates to whatever that character was up to. We're also going to be able to pick things like our class. This comes down to 3 base choices, Mage, Warrior, or Rogue, with each of these having 3 different sub-specializations, but we'll talk a little more about that in a moment when we talk about combat. However, I did want to emphasize that this isn't the only thing you'll apparently be doing in character creation, as you can also choose something akin to tarot cards to decide on events from the previous game at the very least to set up events in Veilguard. And what's more, you'll also be able to customize an Inquisitor who is supposed to serve as your character from the previous game, which is probably the exact right way to do that, seeing as the Inquisition and what happened to that character should be big parts of this game as it follows on from the story there, with us tracking down Solas here in Tevinter. Now, while they didn't actually show character creation anywhere, I'd say that's largely about what you'd expect, but obviously we'll have to wait and see for things like the actual cosmetic portion of it, as well as the full list of various story-related choices. Though they did already say they'll actually be showing that as they move towards fall, of course, when this is supposed to release. But let's talk about what they actually did show, especially in the gameplay reveal, which is a lot of combat and ability gameplay. And right away, I gotta say, you've probably seen it on screen here as well already, that the gameplay is much more action-oriented than the previous titles. In fact, I would go so far as to say it almost looks like a hack-and-slash title. And while the game will also feature up to 2 companions with you that have abilities and things. They showed off an ability wheel, for instance. There's a pause function that you can use to set up each of these abilities as you use them. It does look to be slimmed down in terms of things like tactics from previous entries, with the big emphasis being on your character and what you are doing, which means you won't be doing things like controlling completely your other companions, so no switching to them, and some portions of combat are also a little more focused on specific responses, such as, for instance, parrying the enemy was mentioned. But this alone leaves me with a few questions personally. For starters, if we only have 3 abilities to have active, how is a mage going to play, as mages are often known for their various types of spells, and only having 3 abilities to cast, and presumably 3 spells, might be a little underwhelming, and maybe that's why they chose to show this rogue gameplay early on. And one answer that I may have, but it's purely a guess on my part, is that with this being a more action-oriented situation, maybe some of these abilities are bound to combat-specific prompts, so rather than selecting an ability, you'd say, perform like a light into a heavy attack and perform some kind of combo to do an ability, and maybe they're handling it that way, but I don't have that information here. But with this action-oriented system, I am somewhat concerned about how a mage is going to play specifically. But in any event, all of your classes and their subspecializations are supposedly going to have access to a vast skill line that will give them access to various abilities to use and the like, and each class itself should have access to like 2 different types of weapons and stuff, so there should be a decent amount of custom ways to approach the combat section. But in any event, it's definitely more action than it is tactics and strategy now. And for my part at least, that's not necessarily a bad thing. I do think that what they've shown here combat-wise does look promising for the system they're trying to build with that more action-oriented focus. But I also think you're definitely going to get some pushback here from fans of Origins and its more CRPG-focused combat systems. A little more on that at the end, though. Now, next up, I want to talk about some of the companions and character reveals that they've made, as they've announced all of our 7 companions alongside showing a few different other characters, such as Varric being quite a bit older now, as a not insignificant time has passed between here and, of course, Inquisition. But starting with my favorite character reveal, we have Scout Harding, or former Scout, I suppose, from Inquisition herself, who has now become a full-fledged companion. She was a bit of a fan favorite from Inquisition, and she is the person who would greet you every time you entered a new explorable area to basically give you the lowdown on the situation and what the objectives were. But now she joins your party entirely, and the teaser on their website explains that she actually has some very unexpected magical powers, which is relevant because dwarves aren't able to use magic in this setting. So what exactly that means is obviously of great interest to the lore and whatnot. But then we have Davrin, an elven Grey Warden, who's apparently taking care of a young griffin. Bilara is a Veil Jumper. We didn't see her too much in the gameplay or even the trailer reveal, I would say, but she is apparently an explorer of old elven ruins and uses chaotic magic. Tosh, our Kunari, who goes about hunting beasts for a living. And I believe it's Lucanus, who is a member of the Antivan Crows and is a mage assassin. That is to say, an assassin of mages, I believe. Then we have Emric, a necromancer from Navarra. And finally, Neve, a detective and an ice mage. Now, all of these characters, of course, have their own personalities and interests, etc., and it's got the usual BioWare stuff where you'll make decisions that they approve of or disapprove of. You can potentially romance them a bunch. What's more, though, is in this game, they've apparently gone the route of allowing some of these characters to romance each other if you choose not to, which I think makes for a nice bit of variance and characters who feel a little more alive outside of just purely your interactions with them. But I would say probably pretty standard BioWare stuff there at this point, and generally they do a pretty good job with companions, with I would say really only a few of them being misses for me over the years, and they all look interesting enough. But what are we going to be doing with these companions? Well, they also announced that this game isn't going to be open world, and that doesn't surprise me too much, given that even Inquisition isn't really what I would consider open world, and it's probably the largest in terms of that gameplay style, but they did explain that there will, of course, be explorable areas, and a lot of the side content and main story, etc. is going to be more mission-focused, which makes sense with the relatively linear path we watched our characters walk in this gameplay reveal. So pretty much what I expected there. Now, I do think they need to walk a fine line in that regard because, as anyone who played Inquisition likely remembers, they open up with the hinterlands, which just gives you entirely too much to do and does a very poor job of pushing you out of that area and away from its seemingly endless supply of just busy work. So I'd be very curious to see how they paced these explorable areas, but obviously not much information on that front otherwise. But from there, let's talk choices and stuff before we start wrapping this up. Now, in the gameplay reveal, we did get a few peeks at their dialogue wheel, and as usual, it has their varying options that show the general tone of what you're about to say, and obviously this dialogue wheel can also be altered by things like your backstory or relevant information, such as even just contextual romance options or things like your class. So while I'm not a fan of how the dialogue wheel is presented, I actually don't think it's that much different from other dialogue systems either, and it looks par for the course. Now, I do think it'll be interesting to see whether or not they provide any like game-altering decisions, as I want to know what kind of replayability there will be, because of course there's all the stuff with the backstory and the Inquisitor, but I'm curious how wide-sweeping those effects are and how dramatically they change the course of the campaign. But I would say that just about does it for big reveals and specific information. So let's talk thoughts and general impressions before I actually wrap this video up. So if you've watched the channel a very long time, I am of the opinion that all of the Dragon Age games are fairly different from each other, and this has caused a bit of a fracture in their own fan base, as Origins 2 and Inquisition are not really all that similar, outside of obviously the setting and a few gameplay mechanics. And it looks to me that they're absolutely going to continue with that trend, with Veilguard here being quite a bit different from its predecessors, especially in terms of its action-oriented combat. And just as a general statement of fact, change is never universally liked, so I think you're going to get a lot of people who are upset about that in particular. But speaking purely for myself, I think that the action-oriented combat system they've made here does look pretty solid, even if it's not exactly what I was expecting. Also, having now seen the gameplay and things in motion, I do think that the art style is much more palatable than that initial trailer would have had you believe, even if it still looks a little bit more odd than I was expecting it to. But even just over the course of the gameplay reveal, I kind of got used to it. Another cool thing was just the way they integrated a lot of the characters into it. For instance, when they finally reveal Solas in the gameplay reveal, as well as seeing him kill not Varric, but rather Bianca, his crossbow, while also subtly implying that maybe Solas isn't completely gone and there's still a possibility to save him from himself, as it were. So just little things like that they've done with the characters that they've worked with up to this point. And just to give another easy example, Harding now becoming a companion, I really liked a lot of what they were doing with all of that. I think Harding in particular is just a brilliant move. But on the flip side of those things, I am worried about combat maybe being a little too simple. I also want to see how mages play, because I'm pretty big on, CRPGs, tactics, things like that. And this looks a little more hack and slash, and I'm concerned that if there's, not enough of this type of content and variations and strategies to employ, that it might not wind up being that interesting for me personally, at least. But that's the kind of thing I just simply have to see more of the game to make a firm decision on one way or the other. But one thing I especially liked was actually just the tone and the setting, as we're supposed to be in the very magic-oriented land of Tevinter, and they showed off a lot of that in the gameplay reveal with the city of Minrathous. And they also hinted at a few other locations you can explore and whatnot that look equally as dramatic and in some cases even contrasting visually with this place. And when you put all of that together, I would say very broadly, I think this has a lot of potential to be very good, but there's still a handful of reservations I have there for myself, such as the overall quality of the story. Do they wind up fumbling it with Solas, which I would be very disappointed in? How well written are the bulk of the companions? The combat stuff I mentioned, etc. So I have a handful of reservations, but with this gameplay reveal, I think this is looking very promising, and we'll simply have to see if they stick the landing, or if once the game is actually in people's hands and we're not looking at a, let's be honest, heavily curated piece of a presentation, things look a little different. But I am cautiously optimistic. I will absolutely be checking this out as quickly as I can, so I hope I get a review copy for this one, but Even in the event that I don't, it will obviously have my full attention when it launches, so I can dive into it and take a look at all those different aspects I have questions about, and obviously share them with you via said review. So I certainly hope you're looking forward to that. If you are, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz, but regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.